Hi guys, so I just recorded this entire immune system video with my mic muted for 50 minutes. I was talking with my mic muted, so if I sound a bit hoarse by the end of this one, I apologize. So I'm going to do just a pre-recorded video for the immune system. So if you have any questions at all, please use the Q&A board or contact me directly for more private matters. So I find students find the immune system one of the more challenging parts of this biology course. So as I go through this, I'm going to try to tease out or pick out the important things to kind of focus on. Your textbook, it does a fairly good job of reviewing everything, but sometimes when it gets into those B cells and T cells, sometimes it's nice to have someone kind of explain it outside of the text. So along with reading it several times, sometimes listening to it as well. That's why mastering biology is great, and some of you may benefit from this PowerPoint slide as well. So this little picture, this picture down here is actually showing some of the things we talked about in the circulatory system. So we have red blood cells, white blood cells, which are, they have the important role in fighting infections. And then in this depiction, these green guys are actually a pathogen that's invading. So it's just a depiction of what we'll be talking about here. So the first part of your book, and vaccines I'll mention a little bit later as well, but on page 517 it talks about herd immunity. So what is herd immunity? So essentially it's people that can't be vaccinated, so like young infants or people with certain illnesses like some cancers that kind of really suppress your immune system. Certain treatments will almost get rid of your immune response totally. So those people who can't be protected by vaccines are still actually protected to a large extent because most people in the community are actually vaccinated against certain viruses. So measles is a good example of that. So even though there will be some people in the population that are not immune to measles, because most people are, that means they're pretty safe and not as likely to get infected with measles. So that's what herd immunity means. And that's why, government agencies will make a big deal about everybody being up to date with their vaccines. And that is one of the reasons is to get rid of these illnesses which are preventable, which can cause serious complications. But also it's to protect those in our communities that aren't protected by vaccines, like young babies. Okay, so getting started, kind of an overview of our immune system. It's going to be divided into two main areas, and we'll go through these two main areas because there's kind of a lot for each of them. So the first part is innate immunity. So that means everybody is born with these types of immunity. They're ready regardless. They're ready and waiting for any pathogen that comes along. They don't care what kind it is. They're going to respond in the same way for whatever pathogen or like disease causing, bacteria, virus, toxins. When I say pathogen, that's what I'm talking about, those kind of disease causing things. So this innate immunity is just going to wait for all of those. It doesn't care what type. Then we have the adaptive immunity. So adaptive means that it's going to respond to very specific things. So if you get the influenza virus, your adaptive immunity is going to be able to respond specifically to influenza. So it'll work together with your innate immunity in order to clear it from your system. So there's really three levels. So like we talked about, innate and adaptive. So innate has two parts to it. So external, so this is going to be things like your skin, secretions, so like mucus, tears, saliva, perspiration, all of those things, secretions play a role in defending your body against pathogens. And then we have mucous membranes, which give a protective coating in places like the inside of your mouth, the inside of your nose, your external genitalia. So they have mucous membranes. So those are the first line of defense. So when we're talking about your assignment, that has to do with making analogies between your immune system and the army. Your first line of defense could be things like building a trench around where you're defending, and it could be those frontline soldiers that are on foot, ready to defend against whatever's coming against it. So if you're exposed to influenza at the grocery store, your skin, secretions, mucous membrane, that's your absolute first line of defense. So then we're going to get into internal. So those pathogens have now made it past your skin, past your mucous membranes, and now they're inside of your body. And there are a few things that make up those internal innate defenses. So again, they don't think about what type of cell it is, what type of pathogen it is. They just want to get rid of it. So these phagocytic cells are very important in this internal defense, internal innate defense. So these phagocytic cells here, they travel around just looking for these invading microbes or pathogens, and they almost literally eat them. So they engulf them, break them down into their parts so that they're no longer able to infect our body. So phagocytic cells are eating those pathogens. So another part are these natural killer cells. So natural killer cells, they will float around and recognize your body cells that have been infected by a virus or bacteria. So all pathogens, they like to make it directly into our cells so that they can thrive and multiply, reproduce, so that they can go and infect more cells. So these natural killer cells will actually detect those cells, our body cells that have been infected, and they will release this chemical that destroys them. And then I'll talk a bit more in a minute about the inflammatory response. This is a great picture showing up close of what your layers of your skin look like to protect underneath. And over here are these cilia. So inside your nasal cavity, you have all these tiny little projections that work to sweep bacteria out of your nose. So bacteria being these yellow guys, and this blue stuff is mucus. So again, we talked about those natural killer cells that detect the virus inside your body cells, and then these phagocytic cells that just go around and eat them. So next is the inflammatory response. So let me find my diagram here. So the inflammatory response means, like, if you get scratched by a cat or a splinter, almost always around that injury you have cells that are damaged, and around that injury it's going to get kind of swollen, a little bit red or hot to touch even. And that is a natural response by our body called the inflammatory response, and it's one of those innate internal defenses, so that second line of defense. And what's happening there is these injured cells give off something called histamine. So it's a chemical that these cells give off. And this histamine, so that it's kind of, it's shown by these blue dots here, these chemical signals that are histamine. And what they do is cause the nearby blood vessels to dilate. And when these blood vessels dilate, it's going to cause that redness to happen near the surface because you're seeing more blood in that area. It's also bringing lots of great things to help you heal. So more oxygen, more nutrients to the area, and it's bringing more of these phagocytic cells that's going to eat up any bacteria that came with the injury. So if this were a splinter, there could be some like E. coli or staphylococcal bacteria on it. If it were a cat scratch, it could come with some viruses potentially. So these phagocytic cells are going to leak out into the area and eat up a lot of these bacteria in order to prevent the bacteria or the virus or the toxin from getting to the rest of your body. So that's what an inflammatory response is. And that's part of that level 2. Okay, so we'll start to get into level 3 a bit. So whenever we're talking about level 3, that's your adaptive defenses, and that means your body is detecting very specific pathogens that have entered your body, and it's going to mount a defense against them. So whenever we're talking about adaptive immunity, it's B cells and T cells, and B cells actually give off these guys called antibodies. So another word for these B cells and T cells, it could be lymphocytes, so you might see that term used. And again, this is another way to, bring it back to your assignment. So something like a sniper might be a very specific tactic used by military snipers out there to get very specific person or people, and they're trained to recognize that. So that could be an example of adaptive immunity. And I just wanted to bring up this, I think concept maps are useful for some people in understanding a concept. Plus, in the next unit, you have an assignment that relates to creating one of these concept maps for the urinary system. So this is an example of like level 1 and level 2 defenses. So we start off with your body's defenses as being kind of the main overarching topic. So it divides it into level 1, so being your mucous membrane, skin, secretions, those first line of defense. And then your level 2, which includes those white blood cells, phagocytes that eat them, the natural killer cells that release chemicals to kill off cells that have been infected. So defensive proteins are part of it, but I wouldn't worry too much about this. Like, you don't have to memorize. It kind of goes beyond the scope of this course. You don't have to memorize what these two guys are. And then the third important guy is the inflammatory response, which gives off that chemical histamine, which could be making a fever. That's one thing it does. It attracts those phagocytes and dilates the blood vessels nearby to bring all those good things to help your body heal. So that is, we already went over that one. So which cells would be active during an immune response? So something enters your body, which cells might be active? Phagocytic cells, natural killer cells, or both? Probably both. Blank are special white blood cells that engulf foreign cells. So engulf means eat, and foreign means something that's not necessarily, that wasn't made by your body. So engulfing or eating, those are always your phagocytic cells. So part of your immune system really does rely on your lymphatic system. So sometimes this is included in a circulatory system review. Your textbook includes it in your immune system because it does play important functions for both of those things. So it's important for your circulation. It's also important for your immune system. If you've ever gone to the doctor with something like a sore throat, or your nurse practitioner, they are almost always going to feel around your neck somewhere under your ear. Sometimes with your children, you may see or you may feel these little pea or bean-sized bumps, sometimes in the back of their neck, or in their groin maybe, or at the back of their knees. These are lymph nodes, and inside those lymph nodes there's lots of those B cells and T cells, so and also other types of white blood cells like the phagocytes. So they will often wait in these lymph nodes, and that's often where they first detect that something has entered your body system and start to mount their defenses. So we'll talk more about clonal selection. So those T cells and B cells have to clone like mad to keep up with killing off all of those pathogens. And so those lymph nodes can become swollen. So if you go with a sore throat or some kind of complaint, your healthcare practitioner will feel for those lymph nodes, and if they feel swollen, that's a pretty good indication that nearby there's some kind of infection happening. This time of year, bug bites are a big one. You might notice these swollen lymph nodes near bug bites in your children. So your immune system is working hard against those toxins that, sometimes make the itchiness of bug bites. So question, the lymphatic system returns tissue fluid to the circulatory system and fights infection, or both A and B. So that's both A and B. So how does it return fluid to the circulatory system? This graphic shows, so we talked about arterioles and venules and capillaries in our last unit. So capillaries are very thin, and that's where a lot of exchange happens. So a lot of plasma or water will leave our capillaries to bring things to our cells, and a lot of it will be reabsorbed back into our capillaries, but some of it actually stays out there near our cells. And so the important function of our lymph vessels are to pick that fluid back up, and it actually transports it back up close to our neck and dumps it right back into a vein there to get that fluid back into our circulatory system. So if you ever heard of someone getting, lymph vessels and nodes stripped out because they had cancer and that contained cancer cells, well, the person can then have trouble with swelling in that area because some of that fluid's no longer being picked up. Okay, so adaptive immunity, like I said, so that's the third line of defense, and they're responding to very specific pathogens, and we're going to get into the B cells and T cells. So this is where it can feel a bit confusing, but I'll try to point out what the important bits are. So step one for adaptive immunity is recognizing the invader, or recognizing what kind of pathogen your body's even dealing with. Okay, so all pathogens on their surface are going to display little proteins that are kind of like the marker of who they are. So if this is my pathogen on the outside, he's going to be displaying all these little proteins, these antigens that say, this is who I am. And it's these antigens that our B cells and T cells will actually recognize as not belonging to us, and then they will be activated because they've connected with these antigens. So any given pathogen can have many different antigens on its surface. So B cells and T cells kind of detect these pathogens in different ways. So B cells, so here's our pathogen right here, and these little points are the antigens displayed on its surface. So B cells can just meet up with a pathogen, connect directly to the antigens on the outside, and become activated because of that. So these are called antigen receptors on the outside of our B cells and T cells. And they have very specific, kind of key and lock displays. So if this antigen receptor is a lock, this very specific pathogen, so maybe it's influenza type A, will fit this B cell specifically to attach. So our body has all kinds of different B cells and all kinds of different T cells that will be able to connect with countless numbers of pathogens in the world. This B cell fits perfectly with the antigens on this pathogen. Then he becomes activated. So he's recognizing it. And so we'll talk about, so what does that mean once they're activated? So we'll go into that in a minute, but it's actually like cloning themselves and then actually responding. So T cells are a bit different in that, so all pathogens want to make it inside of our cells in order to thrive and reproduce. So once those pathogens are inside our cells obviously don't like that. So they will actually take a tiny piece of antigen off of that pathogen and display it on the outside. So it's almost like raising a flag saying, hey, look what's inside me, will someone please come help? So these T cells the receptors will actually attach to the outside of the infected cell. So that's the difference between B cells recognizing and T cells. B cells can connect directly with the pathogen. T cells need it to already be inside of a cell in order to recognize it. So adaptive defenses, so these B cells and T cells are activated only after we're exposed to specific pathogens. And it depends on those lymphocytes to recognize them and respond. So when we say lymphocytes, again, that's B cells and T cells. So what substance can elicit a response from a lymphocyte? So a B or a T cell. Which one so that would be an antigen. So that's, like I said, that protein on the outside of the pathogen. So once they've recognized the invader, next they need to clone themselves. So once the B cells and the T cells are activated, they need to rapidly divide in order to make enough of them to quickly kill off the invading pathogen so that it doesn't infect the entire body. So in this example, this B cell is activated by attaching to the pathogen with its antigens connected like a key and lock with this antigen receptor, and then they start cloning. So this B cell will clone into many other effector B cells that are giving off these antibodies, so we'll talk about them in a second. But then they'll also clone into many of these memory cells. So memory cells become important if you're, and we'll talk about it more, but if you're ever exposed to the exact same pathogen twice, these memory cells become extremely important. So antibodies, so what are they good for? So you have this effector B cell, and these cells will actually start pumping out antibodies. So B cells, one type of them, start pumping out all these antibodies. And these antibodies are floating around in your circulatory system, in your lymphatic system, and they are connecting directly to pathogens. So let's say this is a chickenpox virus. So these antibodies are connecting to them like a lock-in key. So there's two ways that makes a difference for your body. So one way is the antibodies are connecting to all of these things and causing the bacteria or the virus to clump up. Once it's clumped up, it's a lot easier for something like a phagocytic cell to come along and say, oh hey, this is some kind of guy that doesn't belong here, I'm going to eat him. So he engulfs them and breaks it down, and it's no longer harmful in your body. So antibodies actually improve the chances of bacteria and viruses being eaten. Another way that antibodies work is that antibodies can come along and connect all over the surface of something like a virus. So once antibodies are completely surrounding it, that virus can no longer attack to your body's cell and can no longer make you sick. So eventually it would just die off because all these pathogens like to make it inside of our body cells. So if antibodies are completely surrounding it, that means it's not going to be harmful to us anymore. It can't enter your body's cells. So B cells make antibodies, which increase phagocytosis and make it harder for viruses to enter your body's cells. So T cells are actually, so moving on to like T cells and why they're cloned. So these T cells could become activated by detecting that antigen on the outside of a cell. And so these helper T cells, they don't attack anything specifically. They don't actually go out and find things and kill them. Their important role is actually activating the rest of your adaptive immunity response. So it activates these B cells that then make antibodies. And it also activates this other type of T cell called a cytotoxic T cell, which will find cells that are infected by your pathogen, attack them, and kill them off. So similar to like those natural killer cells that we talked about earlier, except those natural killer cells, they're not specific. They don't care if it's a virus or a type of bacteria. They just know that that cell is sick and will kill it off. These cytotoxic T cells, on the other hand, are very specific. They'll find the cells that actually have, Staphylococcus bacteria inside of it and kill it off so that that bacteria can no longer survive inside there. So these helper T cells are very important. Without them, the rest of your adaptive immunity doesn't work properly. And this is actually the type of cell that's affected by HIV virus. So people that have HIV that's not controlled by medication, these T cells are very low, can become very low in count in their body. So once these helper T cells are very low and not available in your body, you become susceptible to all kinds of other illnesses. So you can become sick with things much easier because your cytotoxic T cells and your B cells don't work anymore. This is just giving an example of how one of those cytotoxic T cells might work. So it finds an infected cell that's displaying that antigen. It gives off these proteins that then kill the infected cell. Once that infected cell has died, the pathogens inside die as well because they need it to survive and reproduce. So which is the only T cell that actually kills cells? So we know receptors are just proteins displayed on the outside. They're not actually killing anything. Helper T cells, we know, actually activate B cells and T cells that kill things, but they're not actually killing them themselves. So the only one here that's actually killing cells is the cytotoxic T cell. I like this graph as a way of describing like a primary immune response versus a secondary immune response. So if we think about chickenpox, for example. So you are initially exposed to chickenpox right here. You've never been vaccinated, you've never had it before, but you're exposed by a family member that has chickenpox. So your immune system will recognize it, but it takes a fairly long time to build up that response that actually kills off the pathogen, so actually kills off that chickenpox virus. So because it takes so long, in this amount of time you've developed symptoms, maybe you have a fever, you have all of those itchy open sores potentially from the chickenpox virus, so you get sick from it. But your immune system will still respond. It will eventually kill off all of those viruses by, cloning those B cells with antibodies and cloning those cytotoxic T cells, using those phagocytes and the natural killer cells. All of those responses will come together to make you well again. But part of that clonal selection is making memory cells. So the purpose of memory cells, so you might have memory helper T cells and memory B cells, is that once you're better, you could get exposed to that virus again. So right here, you're on the bus, someone has chickenpox, rubs by you, infects you with chickenpox again, but this time those memory cells are like, oh, we remember this guy. We know exactly what to do. We already have lots of these memory cells around. So your immune response is very rapid. So it happens very quickly. So quickly that for something like chickenpox, you're actually not likely to get any sores or symptoms of the illness. So even though, yes, it got into your body, your immune system fought it off so quickly that you didn't even know that you were infected. So it's a very strong response, and it's a very fast response because it was ready. So that would be the secondary response versus the primary. So an example of a question is a primary immune response is so the answer is actually immune response elicited by a first exposure of lymphocytes to a particular antigen. So this is saying the first time you're exposed to a certain antigen, your lymphocytes will pick that up for the first time. So that's a primary immune response. This A is not correct because immune response elicited by the first exposure of memory cells. So memory cells come into play with that secondary immune response. And this one is not correct, production of primary type antibodies in the first day of exposure. So antibodies, yes, your body's going to start to make those in a primary immune response, but it's going to take a while. It's not going to be the first day. Your body has to build it up a little slower with the primary immune response. So vaccinations, we already kind of talked about that you're introducing your immune system to a harmless version of a disease. And your body will it, so it has antigens there. Your body says, oh, look, here's some antigens. We better create some memory cells for this. So you don't actually get sick from it, but your body builds up that immune response, builds up the memory cells so that if you are exposed to it, your body is ready to react quickly. So some of the issues that can come up with your immune system. So one of them has to do with organ rejection. So even our own body cells display certain proteins on the outside of our cells so that our immune system can recognize that, oh wait, this is a self cell. This cell belongs to us. We're not going to attack it. So it becomes an issue if people are getting like an organ transplant, for example. So if I had liver disease and I received a liver from somebody else as a transplant, there's a possibility that my cells will see that liver as not belonging to myself, and it will start to elicit that immune response that's going to kill off those cells. So that's organ rejection. So that's why it's important for physicians to make sure that, you know, the proteins on the implanted organ are as closely matched to yours as possible. So often someone that's directly related to you might be the best type of recipient or the best type of donor for you. And then also they use drugs that are usually administered for their entire life that kind of suppress that immune response so that your immune system isn't working quite up to par, so that it's less likely to reject that new organ. Allergies are another type of immune disorder. So it's really your immune system having this overreaction to something that really is not going to hurt you. So pollen given off by plants there's really no chance that pollen all by itself is going to harm you, or dander, like skin cells from a cat or a dog. Like there's really no chance that those things are actually going to harm you. But for some people, these allergies develop that your immune system goes crazy over these things. So this chart, or this figure here, looks a bit complicated, but I'll go over it in kind of a simplistic way. So here's an example of some pollen from ragweed, and this guy breathes it in. So it's entering in his nasal cavity, and for whatever reason in some people, B cells pick up on this and start to make antibodies. So you start to have an immune response to that, and these antibodies start floating throughout your blood system. So next time you're exposed to that pathogen, these antibodies will bind with that pollen or dander or whatever it is you're allergic to on these certain type of cells that contain lots of histamine. So if we remember histamine from the inflammatory response, that's what causes the dilated blood vessels that bring all those extra things to the area to cause healing, right? So this becomes annoying for people with allergies because this histamine is being released in places like your nasal cavity, around your eyes, or if you're allergic to something on your skin, it will be on your skin, and things can become really itchy, very red, lots of mucus is given off. Your immune system is essentially overreacting. So the extreme end of an allergy is actually called anaphylaxis. So one thing that histamine does in the inflammatory response is dilate blood vessels, so make blood vessels bigger. So that allows, normally, it's a good thing to bring, more blood and more nutrients and oxygen to a wound. But when someone has an anaphylactic reaction to something, that your blood vessels are actually dilating throughout your whole body. And so when your blood vessels get bigger, that's actually causing your blood pressure to drop. So it actually causes a type of shock, because if your blood pressure is very low, then there's not enough blood flow getting to important areas like your organs and your brain. And places like your lung can start filling up with fluid very quickly actually. And swelling can happen because you don't have that circulation to take blood back, or to take fluid back where it's supposed to be. So anaphylactic shock actually causes blood pressure to drop dangerously. So autoimmune diseases are also mentioned. So this is any disease, like this example is rheumatoid arthritis. So it's any disease where your immune system is actually attacking itself. So in rheumatoid arthritis, your immune system is actually attacking its own joints and causing inflammation, redness, swelling, and it eventually starts to break down tissue and causes some deformities in the areas that are affected. Lupus is another example of that. They believe maybe multiple sclerosis and diabetes are examples of autoimmune disease. Type 1 diabetes actually, where your pancreas is affected. They also think maybe Crohn's disease is autoimmune, so meaning your own body is harming its own tissues to cause disease. So we already kind of talked about HIV and how it's those helper T cells that are affected. So when you don't have enough of those, the rest of your immune system, or the rest of your adaptive immunity, doesn't work anymore. And it's been difficult to make a vaccine for something like HIV because it mutates like crazy. So every time they're making a new drug to treat or prevent HIV, or to treat it in some way, it evolves extremely quickly, mutates, and new strains are created. Then the drugs no longer work. So the more drugs we create, the more strains we're getting. And that's kind of the main obstacle to getting rid of HIV. is those very quick mutations happening. It's also kind of one of the reasons why we have to get a flu shot every year, those mutations. Every year, slightly new versions of the flu virus pop up, and so we continuously have to have new flu vaccines every year in order to cover those new strains that come up. So the rest is going into the urinary system, so I will stop there. And please, if you have any questions, make sure you're using the Q&A board or contact me directly for private matters. If you have a question, probably someone else in the group has a question. I've been very impressed with the work you guys are putting in. I know it's a fast-paced course and sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming, but I think you're doing amazing. You know, this unit is a bit of a heavy one, but the next one isn't as bad, so try to put as much as you can into this one for now. And I'm also open to like individual Skype, or I can make videos on things you might need extra help on or extra review, so please just let me know. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your week, and good luck finishing up your Unit 3 activities. I'll see you next Tuesday.